saw no form of any kind the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. Therefore watch yourselves carefully, so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like an animal on earth, or any bird that flies in the air, or like any creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the water below. And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has apportioned to all the nations under heaven. And then also these words from John chapter 4. John chapter 4, beginning at verse 7, where Jesus is meeting and speaking with this woman. And when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and herds?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become to him in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is Jerusalem." Jesus declared, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah called Christ is coming, and when he comes, he will explain everything to us." And then Jesus declared, "I who speak to you am he." This is the word of the Lord. Union Pacific 4014 is the largest operating steam train engine in the world. And it's pictured here earlier or later last week. This is a picture from Friday as the train traveled through Fairfax, Iowa, which is just north of where Rebecca Bellamy lives. This train has been touring the United States this summer to thousands of people lining its rails and population centers and acclaiming this glorious piece of machinery that was built in the 1940s and has now been restored and is touring the United States, wonderfully received. This engine, the largest, it and its tender weighs 1.25 million pounds. And that's before they load the coal and the water into it. This is a beast. This is really a heavy piece of machinery that can travel at great speeds, pulling great trains, and that was its purpose and its original purpose. So imagine if it derails. Earlier this summer in Rawlins, Wyoming, in the yard when it was making a short move, it going over a switch, it dropped a couple of its wheels on the ground. It derailed. And perhaps you might imagine, just imagine, that it takes a great amount of work to get a train like this back on the rails. Now, the commandments serve several purposes. One, they serve as rails on which our lives are meant to run. And they serve by providing guidance to help prevent derailments. That is, from our derailing our lives. Much better to stay on the rails, because coming off the rails will create all kinds of problems. And in the U.S. history of railroading, it will also create great disasters. Like all the commandments, the second commandment is part of the infrastructure, the spiritual infrastructure that God gives so that our lives would be enabled to run rightly. And not only is the design of spiritual reality that we are to worship God alone, that's the first commandment, but also the second commandment, it is the design of spiritual reality that God is to be worshipped without our attention being redirected, without our attention being distracted or given to anything else other than God Himself. Not anything that God made in creation, human form or animals or the creatures that creep on the ground or that fly in the air or that are in the water. Nothing that God created, nor anything that we, in taking God's creation, would form into something else. Nothing that we or God have created should be the object of our worship. And God is properly and rightly jealous, that is, possessive of all our worship. Give yourselves, give your love, give your worship and your praise directly to Him. And thus, you can see that the commandments help us direct our lives as a means of honoring God in all things. That's the tracks on which our lives are meant to run. Those are the rails that guide our lives. So with that, let me ask a few questions. First, why is worshiping God by way of anything that is created or that God created or that we created, why is worshiping God by using those things inappropriate? Well, God Himself gives us some insight into this, which is why I selected and why we read this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 4. Because in Moses, in speaking to the people, tells them there, he said, well, you remember when you got the commandments, when you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, you stood there and you saw nothing. The voice came to you out of the fire, and you saw nothing other than you heard the words. And this was given to you so that you and your children would know that you are to listen to the Lord and to hear His words for you. There was only a voice, the text says, no form. And it said in verse 16 that you should not then be making anything for yourselves. And it lists 6 things that you should avoid. Not in the form of any human figure. Not in the form of anything that's on the earth. Not in the form of any winged bird that flies in the air. Not in the form of anything that creeps along the ground. Not like any fish that swims in the sea. And when you look up into the heavens and see the heavenly array, nothing up there either. Do not be led astray by the glory of the creation, such that you mistake that glory for the glory of God. No form compares to the glory of God, and do not be distracted even by that which is glorious, but less than God. It's the classic way of making the distinction between the creation, and that is things which are created, and the Creator. And do not send your worship into a lesser realm by worshiping anything that which is created, even as glorious as it may be. Worship God alone, because nothing can take the place of God, not even God's creation, let alone something you might make. Yes, the creation bears His fingerprints, and maybe in the summertime you see more evidence of God's glory in creation. You go places, you see things, mountains and lakes and streams and seashores and beaches and all these, and you marvel at the glory of God's creation, and that's fine and that's good. But God is saying, do not mistake even those glorious manifestations in creation to be anything compared to my glory. It may direct us to God, but it is not God. So nothing should stand in the way, not not even things which we or even God would create. In fact, the way that the Bible displays those warnings is actually talking to all of the other cultures that were around the Israelites, cultures that worshipped all kinds of aspects of the creation. And when he lists them, he says, nothing on the earth, nothing, no human form, no animal form, no birds. And that was particularly where the Egyptians directed their worship. He says, none of that. And he said, nothing in the seas. That's particularly where the Babylonians directed their worship. And nothing in the heavens, which was primarily where the Persians directed their worship. None of this is God, God says. It's my handiwork, but it is not me. So be sure you know to whom your worship is being given. And you might say, well, okay, but further, why is that really a problem? Well, I think particularly because not only is it misdirected and insufficient, but it kind of invites us to underestimate God and to sort of box him into even certain forms or pieces of the creation. It lessens God. As much as a glorious sunset might inspire you, it's still much, much less than God himself. And so the key story I think in the Old Testament that illustrates this is the story of Aaron and the golden calf. And likely you know this story because it happens right after the Israelites were led out of Egypt and into their freedom from Egypt. And after they get the Ten Commandments, Aaron builds this golden calf. You can read about it in Exodus chapter 32. And you see, that calf that Aaron built was glorious. I mean, it was made out of gold, right? This was a remarkable thing. It was something to behold. You would be impressed. It was most impressive. It was most glorious. It was most wonderful. And it was not intended to be a replacement for God. It was not set up as a false god. It was not set up as another god. Aaron built that calf not to give people another god, but he built that calf with the intention that it would help the people worship the true God. That's why he built it. The calf was not then an illustration of the broken first commandment. It is an illustration of the breaking of the second commandment, that is how we are to worship. Aaron set it up saying, here, let this represent God for you. Aaron was trying to help. But it was not the kind of help that helped. And God ended up being pretty clear about that. Pretty adamant about that. It was a human attempt, maybe well-intended, but it was a human attempt. No matter how greatly well-intended, it was nonetheless misguided. It was an attempt to facilitate worship by localizing God even in a glorious piece of art. But God understands that what will always happen is that when we attempt to localize God in any way, we will end up beginning to identify that object or that thing or even that practice with God. We'll think that that image, that idol, that object, that practice, that is how and where we will be the ones who meet with God. It becomes the necessary point of contact. They thought, and Aaron intended, that the God's people would be able to worship God through that idol, by way of that golden calf. And that's where God says, no, it does not happen that way. And I think if we do sometimes meet God at a particular place, or in a particular way, or in a particular form, or maybe even by a very particular form of worship or style of worship, over time, we can begin to substitute that for God and begin to believe that I can only meet God at such a place, or in such a way, or by such a means, or at such a mountain, which is the story in John chapter 4. Because they understood that, well, no, in order to meet God, you got to go to that mountain. Others say you have to go to this mountain. And so that became the essential way by which worship would happen. And Jesus freed that woman and gave a teaching to go beyond that woman, that indeed a certain mountain or for a particular place or a particular anything. No matter how holy you might make it, a particular anything is not the means by which you decide how you get to God. So the challenge is that this reoccurs all the time. Any such thing, any such place, any such practice that ends up localizing God and containing God and limiting God is not God. And God lovingly says, it will only lead you astray. It will only mean you go off the rails. Idols box God in and limit our vision, lead us astray as we begin to think that they are the contact point for God and then eventually substitution for God. And God is righteously jealous of our hearts and of our worship. And he says, worship, true worship is that which is offered in spirit and in truth. And I invite you to sense in that the grace and mercy that God is extending to us in the second commandment, saying, no, I want you to worship the way you're meant to worship. And I want you to worship in the best way for you, and that is in spirit and in truth. And so then, we ask the practical question, how then do we as physical, created, limited, material, embodied creatures that we are, how do we relate in spirit and in truth to the invisible, intangible God? Does God give us any help? What can we use in worship then? What are we supposed to do? And it's probably a pretty good question if you think about it. And the answer ends up being not in what we can come up with, that is what we can design or what we can create or what we can choose. It's not about what we can come up with, but to turn the question around and say, well, what has God come up with? What does God provide for us to use and to employ in worship? And maybe, like me, you're thinking of what the answer to that question is. Because four things come to mind right away. Four things. The first, and briefly, the first is, what does God give? One is, he gives his word. And he gives us his word. Worship him with the word, his gift to us, being central. And then in the word is the means by which God says, here is how you will encounter the living God. Here is how you will hear my love and my grace. Here is how you will hear of my instructions for you. Here is where you will gain every truth there is to know about yourselves and about me and our relationship. It's in the Word. It's not worship place. It's not worship style. It's not anything we think needs to be. It begins with the unique gift that God gives to his people, the Bible, the Scriptures. There's a central self-revelation of God. It is a profound gift. That's where we start. And this morning we started our worship service with that reading from Revelation 4, verse 11, which says, we are here to worship the holy God. We are here to give him all the honor and glory and praise, because it's in the Scriptures that we see God. It's in the Bible that we hear his word. It's in his word being preached and read that we hear his voice, that we come to know his truth. And by the Spirit at work in us, our eyes, the eyes of our hearts and souls are open, and we would see the glory of God. It begins with the word. And then second and third, because they go together, second and third are the sacraments. Baptism and the Lord's Supper. Baptism is an act and word of God to his covenant people, that we receive baptism in our helplessness and need. need. And likewise in the Lord's Supper, it's a gift and a word from God to his people as we receive in our helplessness and need, as he feeds our hungry souls for the bread of life and the cup of our salvation. The sacraments are gifts from God, tangible symbols of his powerful mercy and grace that he commands us to use for worship. And you notice that when we practice and we use the symbols of baptism, water, bread, and wine, it's not about the water and the bread and the wine. We see in the water and the bread and the wine what God has done for his church and how God cares and loves his people. And fourth is probably the greatest. Maybe you say the best for last. What's the fourth? Hear these words from Colossians 1 verse 15. That God gives us the very image of the invisible God, Jesus Christ. Hebrews 1 verse 3. The Son, that is Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation, imprint of God's very being, and that he sustains all things by his powerful word. And so in Jesus himself, we then are enabled to worship God in spirit and in truth. Because in Jesus are all four things. Jesus does not limit God's glory or blind us in any way to the extent of God's truth. Jesus does not distract us from God. In fact, he is the exact imprint of God's very being. He is precisely where we meet God. He is the localized point of contact. He is the one and only image that really is God, not a substitute, not a great attempt, but he is the perfect image of God as all the fullness of deity dwells in him. And so you might note this morning that the four key objects of worship attention before you are the pulpit with a Bible on it because the Word is central. The table and the font of baptism because the sacraments are before you. And the cross, which represents all the work that God has brought into this world in the person of Jesus Christ. That's how we worship. And that's why these things are before us. Now let me conclude with two practical aspects then of keeping this, the second commandment. And that is, first, is that the principle of worship is first of all, as earnest as we may be about worship and designing worship and planning worship and participating in worship, that it really is still, first of all, not about what any of us think we want, or as things that are going to be essential for our being able to meet with God, maybe in forms of worship or styles of worship or instrumentation. But it is still, first of all, the Word and the sacraments and Jesus Christ, which is central. And so we have to be diligent to recognize that it can never be about the latest technology or lights or sound or volume or instruments or visuals, whether it's the latest technology like that or maybe older technology like an organ. You see, those are not essential means by which we encounter the living God. Those are tools, but they are not to be the object of our worship hearts. And it's a challenge that we have to be always diligently reviewing. And because it's so easy, I know it's so easy, we are easily tempted to become self-righteously critical of other forms of worship or means of worship or formats or styles or tastes or volume. And all those things can in and of themselves become our focus of our preoccupation and of our idolatry, really. They become idols for us. And people just have to be careful about that and watch out for that all the time. Because it can be just as easy for that danger to be found in traditional worship forms as in contemporary worship forms. Just as easily for high church cathedral worship as for low church rental space worship. Just as easy for robed preachers in wing-tipped shoes in elevated pulpits of churches of great history as it is for collarless, shirted, untucked church preachers who wear sneakers on a stage. You see, these are not the pieces that compel our worship to God. Anything and all of these things can become those that stand between us and the one to whom our hearts yearn. The discerning question is always, is Christ central? Are the sacraments shared? Is the cross reminding us of our identity in Christ? And this is then the second concluding application. That keeping the second commandment changes us and makes disciples out of us. Because see, we become like that which we worship. And in Christ-centered worship, we learn, we discover, we realize who we really are. Colossians, or Corinthians 3, 2 Corinthians 3, verse 18. And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, we are being transformed. We are being changed, that is. We are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. You see, the more we focus on Jesus, the more we focus on Christ before us, the more we become like Him, and the more we learn what we have been created for. And we find that we are not defined by what we wear, or by what we drive, or by what we do, or by how much we weigh, or by our gender, or by our failings, or by our angers, or by our disappointments, or by our triumphs, or any such things, but that we are children of the living King, and that we belong to Him. And He is all in all, and we are created with a high and holy purpose to live for Him and to worship Him as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's what we're meant to be for, and that's who we are. So I invite you to recognize, in the words of a well-loved old hymn, that beautifully put words into our mouths and said in effect that anything and everything else is nothing to me except Jesus Christ. Nothing else matters. Nothing else. It's the second commandment. The song? The song is, "Be Thou My Vision." And the poetic phrasing goes like this: Be Thou my vision. That is, everything I see. Be Thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. Not be all else to me, and everything else is nothing to me, save that Thou art, except for you, except for Jesus Christ. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Oh Lord, we come to you. We come with our needs, we come with our fears and our disappointments. We come with all the baggage of our lives. And what we need to do is we need to see Jesus. We need to know that this world is in His control. We need to know that we belong to Him, that there is a hope, that there is a future, that there is a promise, that there is a kingdom that is coming, and that we are a part of it. So may our eyes be directed to Jesus, and may we know Jesus and Him alone. And as we come to receive your gift this morning, this Holy Sacrament, may we be reminded that it is what Jesus Christ has done for us that makes us who we are. So receive us, O Lord, just as we are. Just as we are. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray.